for this invitation. Yeah, it's funny for me to come here because in a certain way I should know Ben, you know, but it's really interesting for me to actually have, even, I want to say similar, even longer relationship to Johan, even when we met at Ben, you know, and I think there were, I remember, I think there was Ocean was suddenly passing by, you know, and wanting to do that debate. Well, the thing for me is interesting, you know, I suddenly realized I get older, you know, and strangely enough, I started to realize something happened to me in the last 20 years, not only to the world, but also to the way in which I have been grown into that world, that I suddenly realized that with the financial crash in 2008, you know, where certain kind of neoliberal approach that happened to turn the whole idea of what the profession is and what research means probably into a new phase, I suddenly started to realize in order to communicate to a new generation like you, which I assume most of you are studying here, I realized that I might have to explain you what kind of development did I go for and how does it come that I suddenly became interested in the object again? Why, of what kind of necessity is that? And what is actually my disciplinary approach? So what I have thought today, what I'm going to show you is, I'm going to show you basically the kind of disciplinary problem I'm dealing with. So something that I really found out recently what I might want to work on, which I want to contribute to the discipline of architecture. And then I'm going to show you basically two parts of that. One is the part that I have done until 2000, you could say, between 2004 and 2010, roughly, in the mode of understanding the city as a field, as a problem of the field, and what role architecture can play in the idea of growth. And then I turned into the problem that suddenly probably we have to get rid of that idea of the field, and probably there's something that reoccurs, and that is the city as an object. Yeah? So I'm going to show you these two phases, and I guide you through, and I hope we can have a debate later on. So that's why the title of my lecture is The Aggregated Figure and Its Unfolding Grounds. It might sound now very abstract, but you will see it's actually the title for the second part, even when it has evolved from the first part. And that kind of idea means that I became interested in that kind of objects, which means objects that are generally accumulated of millions of the same elements, but in the same time have a figural appearance as well as they have a field condition on the ground. And that kind of idea of the aggregated figure became suddenly more or less my architectural work. But the question, of course, is how can I come to that? And so I have to tell you, when I was probably in your age, this image occurred to me. And that is an image, I think, of a friend of yours who is probably more often here than someone else. And this is an image from a text that Sanford Gwinter wrote 20 years ago, and that became a kind of generational break of totally re-understanding the discipline of architecture. And it was a text called The Landscape of Change. And you have to imagine, until 92 or until 90s, the idea of architecture was that language, representation, deconstructivism, you know, fragmentation was an idea of how you communicate with the complexity of the world. And suddenly Sanford Gwinter comes with the text and says, look, there is an artist called Umberto Boggioni, and what he did is he didn't paint just a painting, you know. He suddenly said, look, what he painted was matter, you know. He was actually painting a stage of matter. And so first he showed the painting, the farewells, you know, which means basically it was a painting about a railway station, yeah, and he showed three scenarios on that railway station. The first part was, you know, it was called State of the Mind, the farewells, where people would go. Then State of the Mind, those who go, and then he would paint the third one, and it is those who stay. And what is so interesting, what Sanford said is, these are not representation of people, yeah. What these are is that someone is drawing a kind of material organization. So the first painting is basically a gas aggregate. It means that what actually the guy drew is more or less a particle organization of gas. And what he drew in the second one is a kind of liquid organization of water. And what he drew more or less in the third stage is basically the kind of a more static, solid idea of that same material like water. So what the first time came up to me, and what came up to a whole generation of people, was suddenly saying, well, listen, we might have to look at completely other ways how forms evolve, how forms are generated, and what could they mean. And so my problem the whole 20 years was basically, how can I instrumentalize that to architecture? What can architecture do with that? And so basically, Jeffrey Kipnis once came with a very interesting idea. You cannot copy that, you cannot represent it, you can only re-originate that in your own discipline. And so what I've tried to do is, how can I re-originate that idea into urban design? Now, for someone who is not a materialist, but a formalist, that would be one of the most key diagram of the city. It would understand the city. It's a plan from Nolly out of 1750, and it would try to understand the city as a figure ground condition. So everything which is black is architecture, which is more or less the ground, and the public spaces are carved out, from that ground. So on the one hand side, you can see what is carved out are not only like streets or squares, but you also carve out churches, which means basically you carve out the interior of a building. So the figure ground condition is where architecture is more or less the ground and the spaces are carved out. And the other diagram, here you see a very nice thing. So architecture is the ground and all this white stuff is like the figure which is carved out. And the other diagram for a formalist is this one. It's a plan from Piranesi, also out of 1760. But it doesn't show a ground where you carve something out. What it shows is basically only architecture. Object, objects, objects, object. It's a kind of crazy plan. This plan never existed. It's a kind of assembly of a history of Rome that never existed before. But what he showed is, the city is not a mass where you carve things out. The city is only based on architecture, which means architecture, architecture, architecture. And what is in between is actually something left over, and people would say this is not a figure ground plan, but this is only a figure plan, which means the object is a figure and the space is a figure as well. So that's a formalist approach. But the question, of course, I had to deal with is, if you deal with today's urbanization, and that was still in around 2008 when I got this image, you can still see that the only way how the city became organized by architecture was in principle in the idea of Piranesi as the first kind of modernist, meaning it was just purely architecture of towers. It had only three typologies: towers, slabs, or one-family houses, and slabs. Oh, well, it seems like in Shanghai. Oh, here, some slabs. Yeah? So there were only three typologies, as more or less. And so the whole idea that basically started up, and when I came into Berlage, is what kind of an idea can I develop in understanding the city, in terms of architecture, as a field. So that was the first part. So my concentration started actually with that plan, and you have to say that plan was the first plan that turned from a city to urbanization. And what does it mean? A city is something like that. I mean, I know you call Frankfurt a city, but the idea of the city as an idea is it is something that has a wall, that has an enclosure, and outside is not the city because inside there is a politics. So that means basically this was the idea of a city, and you can see it was the diagram of Nolly. Everything was just black, and you carved out just the spaces. But then with the growth of capitalist growth, suddenly, everyone moved into the city. In Barcelona, it was like, I think, 830 people per square kilometer. I mean, a density for European of unimaginable size, I think like 7 times. And so he came the first time with the idea that what we do is we just make a grid. And we don't deal anymore with the question of politics and all kind of idea of communal life. We only deal with infrastructure and inhabitation. And so for the last 150 years, the only way what we are dealing with is not making cities, is only urbanization. But what is so interesting on Cerdà, he was the inventor of the word urbanization, but he did something else. He didn't only do a plan, he also said that this is going to be the regimes that are governing urbanization. It's about technology, it's about law and legislation, it's about who has the right to land and who doesn't have the right to land. It's about an administrative principle that means, I mean, Frankfurt is a very good example. Frankfurt is probably the first administrative principle of Neue Frankfurt, of new, is it called? I think Neue Frankfurt, yeah, in the 20s. It needs economics and it needs politics. So the interesting thing of Serdar was the first time there are regimes that govern urbanization, and that's the plan. And he basically came up with, I would call, the first aggregated diagram idea, which means even when that was a block, and you think of it as just being a formal figure, in terms of a materialist, you would see that it actually consisted of millions of ownership, each of them differently to each other, collectively form a block, but around something which is a ground as a void. Yeah? So in terms of the understanding that you don't anymore have just a mass and a void, but that you have actually economics at stake, the question is, how is the land subdividing? And so this is not anymore, my understanding is not a figure anymore, it's a figure that is aggregated out of millions of houses around a void. And that became more or less the idea of how I looked to that process. So I'm going to show you, and I hope I have a little bit, I will see, I think I'm done in an hour, 3/4 or something, but I show you now 3 cities, how I've applied that idea. So first was Phoenix, Arizona. Now, that is Phoenix, and you can see here the diagram of urbanization. In Phoenix, it's called the Jefferson grid, you know, and some of you are from the States or South America, you're much better urbanists than we are, because here you can see the city more or less expanded just based on a grid of 75 miles. And I met a farmer out here, and he said to me, look, I have to show you. You have to imagine that city was growing basically only by 1 mile per decade, between 1910 to 1960. But then it grew like such enormous, and so then he showed me a new map, and he said, look, that's how a broker, someone who is going to develop land, that's his map. And there are projects now, this is Sun City, you know, look, it's very small, but there were projects out there which were really around 40 square miles as one project. What I mean, it's not about few houses and a little thing. It was like 40 square miles considered to be as one go. And so he drove with me out here. We drove along and he said, look, I'll show you something. So we moved out in the desert. And suddenly we were standing here in the middle of the desert, and he showed me that board. I didn't understand a word, you know. I looked at it and he said, we are going to make 82,000 residential units, you know, a business park, mixed-use open space, you know, between more or less 4 miles in one direction and 10 miles in the other. So I thought, you know, I mean, what do I do there? What do I do there? And so of course, knowing that I gave up already practice, I realized it's an academic project. I still wanted to make it at least as a research-based element. So the first question was, what are the regimes in terms of Serdar that govern these layouts? How does the layout come together? How does it make that kind of patterns? What is the driving force? And so I became interested in looking in Serdar's term, what are the economics, what are the political and regimes that operate on that scale? And so the first thing I found was very easy. You found that guy called William Levitt, and why it was easy? Because he was a kind of military camp builder. So he basically was the first one who turned housing into a manufacturing process. Yeah? So he was the guy who said, we're not going to do a little, like a Ford car of just only one car. No, he made housing to become a manufacturing process of 500 houses in one go. So you would say, first you erase the ground, then you do the cars, then you make every concrete platform, and then you put the house on. So he was a kind of urbanist, old militants, so for sure. But the most interesting thing is I got this paper. And this was a paper I found, and it was a paper about a presidential conference of home building and home ownership. And that building basically had certain chapters, and it was produced in 1929, where the Americans had the first time the problem to turn housing into money. Yeah? But of course there was no history for that, so they had to build it up. So there was a first, so I'm not going to go with you for all these 11 books, but this one I like, namely the planning of residential units. And it says, if you make a planning of residential units, you just take a diagram, which is basically a mixed use diagram, what we need in order to live. Then you take an architectural diagram, which basically says how do we place them. And then you hire Harvard or some students, in that case it was Harvard GSD from 1929, and they made now several layouts. And each of the layouts changed in terms of infrastructure and housing, so this was one lane, and based on that diagram they got this kind of suburban pattern. Then they had a new kind of layout with an irregular pattern. Then they started to, densify basically the infrastructure, and made a kind of collective houses of 4, and that became the organization. And so they studied millions of infrastructural modes, here for example the cul-de-sac, and each time what effect it has on a diagram. And then they basically started to validate in a machinic process, started to look what is the average cost of development, and then they came up with what I would call the culture of subdivision of land. They started to basically see how much infrastructure do I have to put in every of these houses, what is this layout, what is this main road. Then they started to calculate each of that. Then they did the same thing for the houses. Then they looked into the variation of housing typologies, and then they said, you have to get $6.28 for 1 square feet. That's the money we need, and then we go. So basically, they had, in order to make that as an operational mode, they had to convince the banks to give them the money to make that land. But the interesting thing is that actually, on the end page of that book, there were never the idea of that study to make a homogeneous landscape of only one family house. There was the idea of having a variety of population within one of that grids. And so 3 years later, they made this book, which can say, okay, what are the rules now to make profits? And so these are the rules, yeah? And so here you see how they applied. This is bad, and this is good. This is bad, but this is good. This is bad, this is good, this is bad, this is good. Because good means everything is equally the same and equally potentially to get the most money out of the ground. So that pattern is not a pattern of beauty, that's a pattern of money, of pure money. Because every idiot triangle of that, you need an architect to invent something. We don't need an architect. We have a manufacturing process where we can put the same, but therefore we need to equalize the ground. So in order for all that to operate, you need that. A machinic tank that erases basically the territory, flattens it to totally horizontally in order to get the thing going. But if you look at the ecology, and that's my uncle is coincidentally, he was in the 70s a kind of freak, he ended up in the desert in Tucson, Arizona, and that's his garden, his wife. So actually in the desert, it's one of the wettest deserts, there's an ecology. So rather than now looking into basically the ecologies, we looked into how does money actually deal with the terrain. And suddenly you see that money has very, very specific features in how you could look in the terrain. So we looked into the topography, we looked into the kind of soil condition in this area, we looked into the kind of biodiversity of the desert, the way how that diversity operates as a geological section, and then said, well look, it is impossible to make a program, so what if we do nothing else as a new study 100 years later, as an answer to the project of Harvard. And so we took just a section out, kind of a quarter mile, and tried to apply this idea and see what kind of population of project we could apply. So that's the territory. So what you can see is, if you don't read that as an ecology, but if you read it as an economical map, then you can see that all that topographies and so produce actually a land value that is in a denser field of differences, that is not the same. It has basically enormous degree of diversity. And then we looked into the housing market, and what was also surprising is that you can see houses from 50 square meters from $50,000 to really one million. And now there comes the little parametric trick. I'm not talking about parametrics anymore. And look, after a while, I didn't tell anyone anymore how I do things, because I realized it's very disturbing, so I didn't say even what I said, so I did something. Okay, we did something. So we did this. What we did is very simple. We actually started to come up with models that has different degree, that could react to the various different degree of land value. But projected on the side, what came out was an interesting field organization as a housing model, because what you thought in the beginning that might be only just a kind of repetition of pure single-family houses, what became interesting that you got enormously figurative voids, like huge landscape parks. You got you got like little boulevards. You got kind of modernist kind of slabs. You got like here mat buildings, like horizontal buildings with just holes. You got here some really very densified courtyard houses. You got here kind of nearly 60s structuralist places. Or you got here kind of a kind of a super studio inverted grid. So the interesting thing was that there's a morphological diversity that appeared that is not just only the repetition of the house, but turns into a kind of general morphological entity. Here you can see them more on a three-dimensional level. So here you could also see that, for example, in some of them the roof became the ground, so you had to enter the house from below. But that became interesting, that suddenly within the territory, within the material organization of the terrain, there is an embedded diversity that became interesting. Now another group said, okay, we wanted to focus more or less on the house itself. And these are these houses that are going blown away when the hurricane comes, yeah? And I'll tell you why, because this is just wood sticks with plaster. So the problem is, one of them looked into what it means to kind of thermodynamics and to the way of how could we change the geometry in order to get less heat radiation, and how could we deal somehow with kind of vernacular ideas of the house, because we had no mass to play with. So what we did is we reorganized the house from a front yard, house, backyard into a kind of vernacular house with basically nothing else as in a courtyard, and tried to come up with a kind of variation of models that where the geometry more or less tried to minimize the heat radiation, but at the same time became a restructuring of the family, because instead of one courtyard, there was suddenly a courtyard between every flat, and that became kind of the internal ventilation system. So what you can see is basically we did something, and what we did basically is we looked into how could we apply various degree of how could we deal with a model of diversity that can come up with not one kind of house, but various kind of envelopes that would allow to carry different kind of programs. So suddenly, based on that economical map, we had envelopes that would basically make a house, but we could envelopes that more or less generate more or less gigantic supermarkets. So this became then the radiation map, and applied on that map, we would come up with that kind of model. The interesting thing was the kind of diversity it would produce on that small scale was the kind of diversity Arizona would produce in its whole scale. So the idea was not about telling the Americans, you're all stupid idiots, you're not allowed to drive a car or something, It was the idea there's another model of diversity embedded within the terrain that will allow to come up with this kind of organizations. Now what is interesting in terms of what I called before an aggregated figure is that instead of a conventional urban plan where you would have an infrastructure, or where you have a boundary, and inside the boundary would have the same kind of housing topology, what is happening here is that it was the raw landscape as a void space, that more or less knitted that kind of objects together. Yeah? So it became basically a ground, yeah, of wilderness, very similar, I don't know if you know that, to Redburn project from Wright. And they turned then basically that project into the house. Now, since I realized, I have to do the last project of a field, yeah, SAC asked me to do a kind of similar project in the States. And there I wanted to apply one more for the last time this idea on a larger scale. And what we did is we took a site which was a very funny site in San Fernando Valley, very out in Los Angeles. And someone told us that the E.T. was shot there, when you have to teach, you need a site, and I looked in Google Earth and I found that pattern. I thought, that's a great site, yeah. I found it. Didn't matter. It doesn't matter if you have ever been there on a site, yeah. So okay, we played the same game. We took the territory. We looked into its topography. And we look basically into a kind of economical map again that would, similar to the one, deal with the idea of that house. But instead of making a field as a purely homogeneous organization, I started to become more and more interesting that within very, very economical landscape like Los Angeles, you would have singularities like roads that would turn out to become very particular figurative spaces, yeah, even within a very, very economically driven environment. So instead of just seeing the city as a carpet of an endless homogeneous element, I became interested that economics produces kind of that figural ideas. And so what we did is we made a studio, and it was the first time a studio that actually I've done with two guys from my institute in Innsbruck, Ursula and Thomas. And so what we did is, instead of going for a kind of subdivision of land, we looked the first time into the idea of the reinvention of the road. And what we looked at following, we tried to ask to develop three kind of figure ground diagrams. One is the modern diagram, which basically takes the object away from the road. We looked in the pre-modern diagram where the road basically is carved out between architecture, and we take a postmodern idea, which basically is the road, the building on the road. And so we came up with the idea of that street, and tried to apply now a kind of model of urbanization that not anymore deals with the terrain of subdivision of land, but with the organization of infrastructure and habitation. So that was our prototypical thing that we gave to students, and we were asking them the following: instead of now making houses of particular kind of typologies, what if you only repeat the single family house on an endless scale in order to operate all these things? So here you see the first project. It basically starts with a one-family house. It has here, everyone had to take, for example, different kind of architectural diagram. Here it was Hilversheimer, and here was the landscape, and I think it was the Unité de Habitation from the ground. Here you can see how this object evolved around the road. And then we applied it on the economical map. And so what came out is basically gigantic masses of objects, single family houses, and you suddenly realize that within that landscape you got really interesting figurative void spaces. And the idea was that suddenly you might produce a city, even totally imaginative, but a city that is not anymore based on the grid as a continuous element, but on figurative spaces in repetition to each other. So that was the first moment where I started to realize I became more and more interested in the idea that within the field there might be objects that start to repeat over the landscape. Now another one is an interesting project. Again, always starting with then it started with a mat building, and here with a kind of solid applied on the side. Yeah, became a little bit funky, but anyhow. But don't see them as form, see them as placeholders for a while, okay? That is a nice road. It basically has here a kind of Hildersheimer diagram. Here it was in Leonidov diagram. So basically produced within the repetition of the architecture a kind of windows of public spaces, yeah, on that terrain. And so here, what was interesting is you would see suddenly that you would have walls that appear, you would see suddenly gigantic flat offices, you would have here kind of really structuralist, formalist houses, you would hear kind of just a pile of objects. And so it was more or less a study in understanding that within the material organization of the city, there is something which you would saw in the very, very first project, you know, a diversity of morphological entities. Now, of course, I had to end up that whole thing with my hometown, and I could only do that because there's a kind of love-hate relationship to Austria. Because Vienna is a very funny city. It never knows, should it be a city or should it be a village? Yeah? And that kind of diversity, not knowing that, became strikingly interesting. Now, this is Vienna, and for the people that don't know, I give you a little intro. This is Vienna, okay? Yeah? Now you will think, hey, what a strange Trummer diagram, but now, this is the Baroque city. So that's actually the Nolly plan. It's not, this is the capitalist expansion, which is the grid where you make money, and then the socialists came, yeah? And that's social democratic urbanism, project, yeah? And of course, in that tradition, it went on, and that's the new confetti plan. That's the new plan for 2009, and so basically on that idea here, project, they got a new project, and that is this project in Aspern. And Aspern was a very funny thing. It was the former airport, yeah? And as you can see, you ask yourself, hey, where am I here? Is this Vienna? No, this is America. This is desert. Because here you can see, here, there's no organization of city, there is just project, something here. Oh, Herzog de Meuron, first housing project, here, little stick, 1991 or something, yeah? And so in that area, they basically did a project. And you can see it is the largest project Vienna ever got. It's one of the largest projects in Europe. And of course, Vienna had no better idea than decide for that plan, yeah? To decide for a village in the city, and it was by Torwart architect, who don't know them, these are people who are from Erskine, yeah? Well, basically, you should know. And Erskine was a totally fan. Of course, he did biker wall, but on the other hand, I did a lot of, the idea was the village. And the funny thing is, it was actually as if Vienna never really could struggle, you know, in becoming a city. And so, in that time, I realized I became an Otto Wagner fan, and because Otto Wagner was probably the only last one that ever, you know, considered the city as a whole. So what we dealt with in that time was with a very interesting person, because as more as I got interested in economics, I suddenly found someone that gave me really the insight of all that what drives our cities today, and they are for economics called hedonic price models. And what is crazy on that price models is that everything is turned into money or measurable in money. And so you can see whenever you would consider how price of land is, it goes from the distance to the metro station, okay, we know, to recreation area, yes, I can imagine, I closer am there, but it also tells you how many persons are employed in a service is also a factor of money. It goes even that what kind of building typology, the surface to lot, the slope of the land, okay, that's a physical entities. But it goes even into environmental characters, into kind of neighborhood characteristic, new beginner factor, yeah? Is a money, or UP factor, age factor, or how many people are not from the EC is a factor, yeah? So you can imagine whatever you do, don't believe that you can go away and have an alternative next to capitalism. You are part of it, you are measured already. So the type of seller is an economical value, you know, the type of buyer, you know, and even how far you go to somewhere and to a district. So that means basically, however you deal with economics, it's nearly all measurable that is turning part of the money. So what we did is we said, okay, this is Vienna's last chance of ever becoming a city. That's the last land that belongs to the city of Vienna. And so instead of making a proposal only for the airplane, we thought of, let's activate, Otto Wagner and give him a city back. But of course the question was today, what could be the architectural model for that? And strangely enough, Austria has developed a very, very interesting kind of model of architecture that is unique and which is called, you could say, the mega block. It's not like a 19th century block. It's not like a single family house. It's kind of large-scale urban superblock that basically spans over a couple of houses. One of the biggest one people know is that one of 1920, which is a kind of 2-kilometer one housing block with a huge landscape in between. But that went through a long history, For example, in the 18th century, you had huge soldier hospitals. You had huge kind of, this was the hospital, but you also had that for the horses, yeah? So, you see? And so in that kind of tradition, we invented a kind of new block, but not anymore in the idea of a social democratic model, but we started by subdividing the land just in individual houses. So this is not land in terms of governmental land, that is land belonging to one person, yeah? But as a collective entity. So 400 people or more or less belong to the land. So you could see it was the idea of taking on Serdar's block with the subdivision of land and then, building on that land a kind of prototypical block. And instead of now having a kind of collective interior, the only thing what is collectively back is kind of a pure form of circulation. Because you could circulate on the roofs down to the house. Now, I applied now on one of these economical maps. You see, we did always the same trick, taking a little part and then applying it. We took that out, we looked at the economical landscape. In this day, I have to say, it's really, really very precise, because in the moment that we dealt with the money of the city, we really turned it into a kind, we really wanted to test it not only as a kind of academic thing, we really wanted for one time see what effect it would have. And so what you would apply is a kind of mega blocks of diversity houses. But what you can see this first time, its idea is not anymore that it's one gigantic thing. It becomes a population of little objects that together form more or less that kind of block. And so what happened in that, and this was the last project in 2009, before I went to Innsbruck, the interesting thing came that I suddenly started to realize that it becomes totally useless if I keep on going with that kind of project. Why? Because the economics have changed in such much that the question not anymore was a question of how you could expand the city, or can have any contribution. But what rather happened is that things happened and that I saw in Vienna as well, that basically the city might not be produced as a field as all. The city is only produced by projects in themselves, which means it's singular objects next to each other that produce it. And so what turned out to me is basically I might want to change my study into the city as an object. Now, the first gigantic object I saw was that kind of mega thing. Yeah? This is Foster's building in, for the Apple headquarters. And in order to understand, if you see it now, the American landscape, it becomes useless to think that this is going to be the question of urbanization. The question of urbanization is that this is going to be not anymore a building, it's going to be a city. Now, that is not something totally unique, because if someone, I don't know if you know Rem Koolhaas or the idea of Delirious New York, you would see there is a whole idea of the city, of the object as a city. But the interesting thing is, it already asks, of course, what kind of city I should investigate in. And so I suddenly started to read and return into Hilversheimer, and I found that interesting thing of a modernist, where he said, look, probably modernism was not a question about trying to invent a high-rise. Because what he suddenly said, Hilversheimer, in the book of the Großstadt, where he looked at the city as an economical model, he said, look, a single building is no longer an object, it is only the place where elementary assembly of singular cells assume physical forms. So that means it's not about the question that we have figurative, let's say, one-family houses, slabs, or towers. What actually happens is what I would call the aggregated figure in its unfolding ground, which means a building is in itself a building as much as it is the city in itself. And so I looked into kind of whole history, and here, yeah? And so what I started to say is with this diagram, I looked now and I suddenly started a kind of historical, more or less, surgery on buildings that are built up on singular cells but produce in themselves grounds for the city. Now, and here I show you some of the history. One we know is Le Corbusier Villa Immobilier. It's the repetition of singular houses producing a gigantic block with producing a ground of the city in the middle and a ground on the roof. Now, another one is Leonidov's House for Industry in 1920. A very interesting project. It was a huge slab, but as you can see, it was drawn by singular cells for inhabitation with collective figurative grounds in the middle of the slabs. Now, another thing was, for example, Ludwig Hipposheimer. Don't look at the buildings, don't look at them as objects, as bodies. Look at them as diagrams. And the interesting thing is, it was a diagram of stacked architecture, whereby each architecture produces the ground for the next architecture. Then, of course, Unité de Habitation in Marseille, where you can say you lift up the building, you get a ground underneath, you produce a road in the middle, and you have the roof. Then you can see the Met building, the repetition of single-family houses as a gigantic two-dimensional building with huge figures, carved out, in that landscape. But of course, you had also that postmodern diagrams that I showed you before. I showed you just a few projects that I found recently because I got interested in Abraham after he died, recently. And so, for example, these were projects in the 60s where he would have studies of linear cities. What these linear cities would be, where the infrastructure would turn into a public space, like tubes, and around you would have kind of aggregation of housing units. Or, also a very interesting project by Paul Rudolph's, kind of reorganization of Manhattan, where underneath you would have the road as a public ground, and around that ground you would have inhabitation. Now then a very funny Dutch thing. Well, in the beginning it looked like kind of a little tree houses, but what is interesting is as a thing, it's actually a building, aggregated figure, with a thick plinth, which basically means that the earth, where the public program is embedded within the plinth of the building, and the aggregation of the housing units around. But then there is also, for example, Rossi, and if you don't look at Rossi in a sense as a pure formalist, but what you can see, it was nothing else as an aggregated figure of individual houses which have inserted void spaces like this enormous kind of archaic slab in the middle. And one interesting project, hardly anyone knows, but it became very interesting, is an aggregated figure from Elias Angelis with which where basically the city continues into a building, and you have that kind of, let's say, stage grounds above it. And I became also interested in another project, and that is John Portman's towers. Because what John Portman did is, he reinvented the lobby in a new kind of public form, which means he not only arranged all its hotels around the core, but basically he reinvented not only the lobby on the ground, but the lobby as a gigantic void space, that more or less goes for the whole building as one, you could say, urban entity. And one project that basically fascinated me and was basically a key beginning to my architectural career was that Congress Center in Agadir from Koolhaas. And after a while I suddenly understood it. It was not a new model of an aggregated figure as a ground, it was a recombination of some historical models. On the one hand side, it was a mad building on the roof that more or less looked like Candeli's Woods, but in the same time it had a diagram that opened it and elevated from the ground, and it became a diagram from Le Corbusier. But if you look at it in section, it's also Leonidov, because underneath you have a plinth. But funny enough, it has public programs that introduced it. So, as an introduction, what I started to do now, and that was just recently in the last 2 years, I suddenly to say, look, let's look into the cities and turning the city into objects that in themselves are not buildings, but buildings that unfold as an urban ground as well. And so what I did as a very one is just taking these architecture models and try to reinvent some of them. And I want to give you kind of little final taste of where that whole trip goes. So one project we did was basically a project where we said, okay, how can we learn from Portman? Now, being back in Austria, we said, these are all villages. What if we turn a village into a hotel? So we turned then villages into gigantic hotels, and in that hotels they had then void spaces that more or less could carry all that program in one. And so basically we would aggregate the kind of alpine area into just buildings, buildings that in themselves, on the one hand side, not only inhabited hotels, but a hotel is just a model for that inhabitation. And that's basically what the aggregated figure, consists out of millions of that inhabitation, and in themselves they carry a public program. Or, for example, the wall, it's a kind of wall building, of 300 meters long that in themselves has all these terraces and public functions. And then this was the site. Oh, sorry. And this was the site, a valley where then these buildings would start to become kind of new villages, as buildings. Now, then we turned into an urban area, and that was in Philadelphia, where basically we started to look in projects like this, where we said, okay, how can we learn from the Things Hotel as an urban entity with a kind of stacked platforms. Now, so what came out is basically a kind of swarm building, consisting out of millions of different kind of housing units, but that in themselves had millions of stages, that would carry kind of an urban program in themselves. So here you would see terraces, collectives reproduced as a kind of new entity within that urban fabric. So as you can see, when this is a city still produced by capital expansion of the ground, the question is, how can you return the city into a building where it produces the ground in itself? Then the question was, how can we learn from Rossi's idea of the arcade, of the kind of void space intersecting? Now that this is one project, it is a kind of gigantic mass that is sliced in with void spaces where the buildings are more or less like a continuous section that are each time, kind of split off by these void elements. Now that's a difficult one, but Hildesheimer was an interesting model, but because he was probably the first one that came up with an idea where architecture becomes the ground for new architecture. And so the kind of project we developed was a kind of towers, where in principle one object became more or less the urban ground for the next object, for the next object, and for the next object. So what you can see is basically, on the one hand side, it becomes nothing else than entities of buildings, but each building in themselves becomes the entrance for the next building. And that project became interesting. How can we deal with Leonidov's idea of making a kind of part of the city within the sliced figure in itself? And so what became out is a building where you don't have towers, but where you have a building, a gigantic mass, where every collective that goes vertically is not the one that basically belongs to the building. And so you would have kind of gigantic forms of void spaces that carry this kind of sliced figures together. But what would you have is you would have a reinterpretation of the building as a collection of that. So that means the ones that use the same elevators are not the ones that have the same address. So on and on, as a last thing, that's the kind of work we are going to do, and I have to say thank you very much for your attention.
Question time.
Nothing to say.
Do you also look at some of the projects you are working yourself and or with your students as part of the landscape work?
Well, the thing is this, you know, when I started to do this, let's say the first part of the program, which I call now the field, yeah, I knew that there was in the States, and especially also on the A, and actually, I think even Johan and Jeff with the idea of the field. I mean, the field basically came out from what I saw, because Jeff Kipnis showed me once the first project you did with also Michael and so, where I realized there is an offspin in the territory, you know, where you learn from the territory and from the field as a sectional project, yeah? Which basically to turn the city from a horizontal plan into a sectional plan, and that sectional plan would produce a kind of programmatic diversity. Yeah? So when I looked at some of the landscape urbanism part, you know, that I have figured out, it was for me a combination of the fascination of diversified program from Ram Koolhaas, yeah, with a reinterpretation of Colin Rowe's urban field figure ground plan. But you know, what I became interested is, what is the role of architecture? So the question was not so much, is landscape a matter for me? The question is, what is the role of architecture in that urban production? Because if you looked at Chinese cities, if you looked at Indian cities, yeah, they were produced by architecture and not by landscape. Yeah? So that's why I had to go back and had to find the moment in history where is architecture, where became architecture the first useful element for the expanded city. And that's why I came back to Serdar, because he was the first one who said, look, we're not talking anymore about public spaces, we're not talking about anymore about landscapes. What we talk about is purely infrastructure and habitation. That doesn't mean that landscape is not there. That doesn't mean that landscape operates. But for me, it was a little bit, I wanted to go the other way around. I didn't want to make architecture, you know, emerge from landscape. You know, I wanted to come up with an architecture model that drives the city as a production. Yeah? And that was my materialist, basically why I became interested in economics was, as I told you before, was basically how can I re-originate the materialist idea on the one hand side as a force, namely economics, but also as a form productive device. And so in order to simplify the project, it was very simple. If you say that, for example, if you want to get water from a liquid state to gas, you know what I mean? You just turn on heat, yeah? So basically you have two kind of entities. You have an extensive entity that is basically that physical entity, and you have an intensive one that basically is energy or heat. And so what I tried to re-originate that is to say the territory is my intensive property of land value. That is that what is different in all cases. That what is very, and the architecture model, that it is extensive property, that is going to become reinvented each time when it meets the territory. So I didn't want to turn the land as an ecology. I want to see it as an economical property. Yeah, and that was my translation.
In that respect, I would have a question about scale. Scale on two levels. One is very question just coming out of one second neighbor, this year they're working on It's basically the same idea that you end with, basically that architecture and building is a major contribution to, or a principal generator of the urban space. But in order to understand that, we will scale it down as we look at, in a sort of bottom-up fashion, the infrastructure and single out identify a particular infrastructure that comes along with one particular line of architecture required.
Look, you're totally. Look, I think you're totally right. It was politically incorrect what I did. You know, I have to be very honest. It was politically incorrect, and I'll tell you why. The reason why I didn't want it to look into the detail and the way that detail produces is because in the very early stage, in the second year, I did a Chinese project, and I very closely came also to in Mexico City with vernacular things, and I suddenly realized, look, urbanization is a political instrument, because every time when I detach it from an institutional point of view, that means money, governmental money drives it, then immediately I'm in the vernacular and that organizes itself. So I know it's in that sense politically incorrect, not because I did not bottom-up learning from self-organizing model. I really wanted to use the power of governmental institutions that drive urbanization with rigid grids and money in order to have a critique on their regimes. So what I wanted to do with that work, and that's why you're totally right in scale, the reason why I had to do that on a certain scale is to show to the production of the city and to the governments of, that it's not only, because since you rule the game, capitalism is not, if someone believes that capitalism organizes itself, you would realize the reason why it worked in Europe so well is because Zera said you need a very good administration. And as better your administration is, as better you can make money. I mean, the reason why some of the Eastern Europeans, or the things I hear from friends of mine in Ljubljana, have difficulty because if you don't know whom the land belongs to, I cannot invest. And so, in that sense, I used that very large-scale operation, in order to I imagine I'm government, I mean that's why but I hope I misbehaved, But you're totally right. We never really looked out what, I mean, is there a new idea of infrastructure, or is there a new invention that can govern that growth, We still more or less rely on conventions that are within that territory, like in the States, we say it's still by cars and...
Certainly you wouldn't say it like it's neither politically incorrect nor being wrong. The other fascinating thing, which one spends a little time looking at the bottom-up strategies in architectural design, I think we're certainly going to realize, or at least quite a few are going to realize, that it doesn't quite work either.
Yes.
So, in fact, the bottom down and the top, the bottom up and the top down approach as paradigms basically need to be somehow optimal.
Yes.
But that's also why I'm, I think that the work is fantastic. I also think that it's a wonderful lecture in being, historically and theoretically so enormously well founded in things, but at the same time also a very important sort of journey that you're taking us on through to this. And I can find also that, in fact, one part of your, the various sort of phases in your own development, one phase doesn't cancel another. I mean, I still think that they're all there.
Oh yeah.
In operation. But that also leads me then to where do you think you take it now? I mean, when I saw the section of alphabets, I was was also wondering at one point, because I think that's really powerful to look at these historical examples.